Rich, what is the fraud triangle?
The fraud triangle is a common way for us to describe the three common elements of any fraud. And as you might imagine, being a fraud triangle, there are three elements. The first element of the fraud triangle is pressure. And when we talk about pressure, in most cases, we're talking about financial pressure, people having problems paying their bills. We have other types of pressures associated with fraud that often relate to vices, gambling, drinking, drugs, other types of addictions. And these pressures cause people to act in ways that they wouldn't normally act. The next element of the fraud triangle is opportunity. And so even if you have financial problems or you have vices, if you don't have the opportunity to commit fraud, it's probably not going to happen. So when we talk about opportunity, we are typically talking about a lack of internal controls. So when all is said and done, we often point back to missing internal controls or weak internal controls in an organization, which allows an individual to commit that fraud. The third element of the fraud triangle is rationalization. And when a person commits a fraudulent act, they rationalize what they've done. In many cases, individuals who are committing fraud are not individuals that we would typically associate with committing fraud. So how do they rationalize doing this? They may embezzle from their employer, and their rationalization is, it's just a loan. I'm going to pay it back next month. It could be a situation where they are a little bit more vindictive. My boss said that I was going to get a raise. I didn't get the raise. As a result, I'm going to steal money every month, and I'm not going to feel bad about it because it was owed to me anyway. So when you take these three elements of the fraud triangle, pressure, opportunity, and rationalization, you create a situation where someone is able to commit fraud. Many people are very high integrity individuals. And when we see in our newspapers and we see on our websites these fraud stories, in many cases they're people that we don't expect to commit fraud. So how did this happen to them? Well, if you think about the fraud triangle, these people had intense pressure. They had a lot of opportunity and they rationalized what they did. But they don't need to be equal, the three elements of the fraud triangle. So for a high integrity individual, it's going to take more pressure. It's going to take more opportunity. It could take more rationalization. But ultimately, anyone is capable of committing fraud.
Well, Rich, looking at an entry-level employee, how, and especially a student who's just taking their first job, how should they use this information about understanding the fraud triangle, well, in identifying a fraud, and how could they help prevent a fraud?
If we only knew how to prevent frauds, we'd have the golden key in our hands. However, what we can say is, if you think about the three elements of the fraud triangle, and you look around you, you look at your coworkers, you look at your bosses, who is in a position to have these three elements? Is there someone you work with that is feeling extreme financial pressure? Is there someone going through a divorce where maybe their financial condition is changing dramatically? Is there someone you work with that has a gambling problem? So we can identify certain red flags in individuals from the pressure standpoint. We can also look at the opportunity issues. As new employees in an organization, we often find that our company is not doing things the best possible way. There are weaknesses in internal control that we become aware of. If we associate an individual with these pressures in their life along with these corresponding opportunities as a result of their job, that's the type of person that we have to look at as a potential fraudster. We're not saying that they're committing fraud, but the key, if we're going to try to identify where fraud can occur, we look for those elements of the fraud triangle.
Could you give us a quick example of where, say, an entry-level employee might see fraud? Maybe a real example of what's happened We often hear that fraud is often done by people who've never have a background of incredibly good behavior, but suddenly they drift into this. You got an example?
Sure. You might get hired in a small family business to be an entry-level employee. And one of your responsibilities might be to put the books together for this company. And let's assume that we're dealing with a construction company. And so most of the people are out in the field. They're either coming up with cost estimates for jobs, they're bidding on jobs, or they're actually working on jobs. You're in the office by yourself. You're responsible for opening the mail, paying the bills, doing the payroll, doing the bank reconciliation. As a result, you have control over pretty much everything. And over time, you build trust with your employer, and now you have that opportunity where it's highly unlikely, unless someone from the company is checking your work. We don't have any segregation of duties. You are now in a position of power. You have access to the bank account. You could create fake vendors. You could create fake employees. So we talk about the importance of controls. Your employer needs to have controls in place to prevent any individual from having that much control over the books and over the finances. Because when you have that control, if you lose your integrity, if you get some intense pressure that causes you to do things you wouldn't normally do, you have the ability to do it.
Oh, thanks, Rich.
Thank you.